We often imagine 1177 BC as a primitive, isolated time. In reality, the ancient Mediterranean was a hyper-connected world, operating with a level of globalization that mirrors our own. This was a small world network, dominated by an ancient G8. Major powers like Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, and the Assyrians maintained constant, daily contact through a sophisticated web of trade and diplomacy. But this high-functioning network shared a massive vulnerability: its supply chain. To survive, these empires needed to forge bronze, an alloy of 90% copper and 10% tin. Tin was the oil of the ancient world, and they were forced to drag it across thousands of miles from the mountains of Afghanistan. No empire was self-sufficient. Their survival relied entirely on uninterrupted daily trade and the fragile diplomatic treaties that kept the roads and sea lanes open. Then, at the absolute peak of this interconnected era, the world goes dark. Within just a few decades, opulent palaces burn, and thriving cities are reduced to ash. The very globalization that brought these civilizations to their highest heights is exactly what created the conditions for their sudden, total collapse. For generations, historians blamed this destruction on a singular historical bogeyman, a mysterious group of seafaring marauders known as the Sea Peoples. This theory was built on ancient Egyptian military propaganda, which depicted massive naval invasions and the pharaoh single-handedly defending society from bloodthirsty invaders. Archaeology reveals these Sea Peoples were actually migrating families, traveling with their children and household goods on wooden carts. They were climate refugees, fleeing an environment that had become unlivable. The first true invisible killer driving them out of their homes was a megadrought. Core samples from dried-up lakes and stalagmites show that a severe dry spell setting over the Mediterranean for up to 300 years, triggering widespread famine. As the crops failed, a second invisible killer emerged, a 50-year earthquake storm. Active fault lines released their pressure in a sequence of violent tremors that systematically leveled the major fortified cities of the Aegean. The Sea Peoples didn't cause the collapse. They were merely a symptom of a much larger, inescapable environmental polycrisis. To understand exactly how an environmental crisis breaks a civilization, modern analysts run this historical data through computer models. They view the Bronze Age as a vulnerable grid to identify how a domino effect takes hold. The models reveal a fatal structural weakness. If just two key nodes, the powerful Hittite Empire and the international port of Ugarit, are knocked offline, the entire global network shatters. When the grid failed, the tin supply chain died with it. Without tin, kingdoms could no longer forge the bronze weapons seen here, leaving them defenseless against starving invaders and their own internal rebellions. The result was a total systems collapse. Central governments dissolved, the elite vanished, and the trade network that had sustained the world for 5 centuries was severed. While historians traditionally call the following 400 years a dark age, it was actually an era of extreme, forced innovation. Because the tin supply chain was dead, survivors were forced to figure out how to forge a locally abundant but much harder to work metal, iron. Survivors like the Phoenicians thrived by turning chaos into opportunity. They bypassed the complex, dead bureaucracy of the old palaces by standardizing a simple alphabet. By moving writing out of the hands of elite scribes and into the hands of everyday merchants, they democratized the ability to track shipments and secure contracts, effectively restarting international trade from the ground up. The collapse of the Bronze Age wasn't the end of humanity. It was a brutal evolutionary filter that forced society to adapt or die. Today, we live in a small world network that is exponentially more complex and fragile than the one that collapsed in 1177 BC. We face our own polycrisis of extreme weather and shifting migration, while relying entirely on specific raw materials like lithium and microchips. As the blockage in the Suez Canal proved, a single failure at a geographic choke point can halt global trade. We know how quickly a supply chain failure cascades into domestic panic, leaving grocery store shelves empty in a matter of days. The events of 1177 BC show that no civilization, no matter how advanced or globalized, is too big to fail. Survival in an interconnected world requires redundant systems, resilient leadership, and the willingness to innovate the moment the old system breaks.